Mary, I'm going to ask you to start out by just kind of explaining your old job. I mean, national security is, in pop culture, more closely associated with the CIA, right? But its hub really is at the Department of Justice. Explain why, and explain how Monday's decision makes that even more the case.
So, the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, they're part of the president's national security team, along with people like John Brennan when he was the director of the CIA, the director of our intelligence community agencies, and all of the national security agencies. And they sit together at the White House in the Situation Room in a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, and talk about national security issues of all sorts of flavors on a daily basis. And the president seeks the advice not only of his legal advisor within the National Security Council, but also the advice of all of the principals who are part of that national security community. And the Department of Justice, also through its Office of Legal Counsel, is a really important part of ensuring that the proposals that are brought to the president, the policy proposals, the actions, are consistent with law. That's domestic law and international law. And I will tell you, in my experience, the premise that undergirds the majority opinion here, that in order for presidents to act fearlessly and boldly in our national security and other matters, they can't be chilled or cowed by the prospect of criminal prosecution. That's just not what is driving these discussions about how to respond to national security issues, whether they're defense-related issues, intelligence-related issues, terrorism issues, or so many other things that come before the National Security Council and the president on a daily basis. So this notion that you need to provide this broad criminal immunity to ensure that presidents can do their job, I think that's just a fiction. I think that was an excuse to write such a capacious ruling that expands presidential functions, what are called in this decision core executive functions that derive allegedly from the Constitution. This capacious, expansive ruling really doesn't have any grounding in our constitutional text or our history, and it's not warranted by any kind of practical necessities. And one other thing I would say is this opinion also seems to assume that we have other functioning remedies for a president who does something that is so, meets the criteria that Justice Alito talked about. But those other methods, things like impeachment, those have failed us in recent years. So the notion that now there is no backstop, that's why you have people so concerned about this opinion.
So, Director Brennan, tell me how this happens operationally and functionally if the president of the United States, as Trump did last time he was president of the United States, wants to do something illegal. And his lawyers, I think Don McGahn, sometimes said, hey, no, that's illegal. He actually would write that down, have his note taker, Annie Donaldson, write it in her notes, too, and then send him a memo saying you can't, for example, prosecute Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey because it's illegal. We know a little bit less about what he wanted to do at the intelligence agencies. We know a little bit more about what he wanted the military to do. At some points, jail migrants. At other points, invoke the Insurrection Act. At other points, seize voting machines. But if he's not stopped by the fear of the consequences of criminality, what happens?
Well, a lot happens, and it's not good. It's hard to be shocked during these abnormal times, but I truly was shocked by the breadth of this Supreme Court ruling. As Mary noted, there are legions of lawyers in the government to ensure that all the actions that the government officials take are going to be legal. And when a president is going to authorize some type of action, whether it be a covert action or some type of military action, there is rigorous legal review that is done at the White House by the legal counsel, but also by the interagency lawyers group to ensure that every order that a president gives is going to be solidly anchored in the law. And this is not to protect a president's, eventual criminal liability. It's because, at least for the 6 presidents that I served, all of them wanted to make sure that everything that they did, everything that their administrations engaged in was going to be lawful. And so the President of the United States is the chief executive of the executive branch. And so, as Mary's mentioned, the breadth of this ruling is really quite astounding. And I don't think the justices who voted in support of this ruling really understand the implications here, because the president heads up all the departments and agencies in terms of military personnel, law enforcement, intelligence, homeland security. There are so many different opportunities for there to be some type of nefarious action that a president would authorize. And as was pointed out in your lead-in, it's possible that a president could, in fact, issue preemptive pardons to those individuals who would carry out this unlawful act that a president alone is immunized against some type of liability, but they are not unless they actually are giving a presidential pardon. So again, the scope of this, the implications of this, especially if a lawless, corrupt president is going to be in the White House, it is really quite chilling in terms of what could happen.
You know, Frank, we also cover Trump like he's a question mark. He's an answer. He's answered it. He wanted to break the laws. He wanted to have evidence manufactured. He wanted Don McGahn to make up things that didn't exist to get out of criminal exposure with Mueller. He wanted Border Patrol agents to do illegal things, and he dangled pardons in front of them. We also know what he already did at his Department of Justice when it came to wiretaps. We found out at the end of his presidency that he was listening to all manner of journalists. He was listening to lawmakers. What does this absence of any semblance of fear of criminality, how do you assess what Trump would do in a second term with all of the awesome powers of the FBI?
Yeah, as you said, he's told us what he's going to do. He's already done some of it. As it's engraved in over the National Archives in Washington, the past is prologue. Exactly. The past will tell us where we're going in the future with him. And I often think, you know, as I'm contemplating what the impact is on the national security community with this ruling, at first, my reaction was, boy, we're going to have a lot of people in the intelligence community doing unlawful things. But then I stopped myself and I reread the opinion, and it's worse than that, because we've redefined what lawful means in this ruling. So, you know, oh, it's going to be unlawful. Oh, we'll have unlawful. No, if the president says it's lawful, it's in the scope of his official duties, his core duties. He's consulted with his attorney general or his Department of Defense secretary, then it could be deemed lawful. So it's not the unlawful acts that I'm worried about. It's the so-called lawful acts that he's going to go forward with. And with regard to Sam Alito's concept that, oh, the dissenters are just talking about extreme hypotheticals, none of this is hypothetical. We need only go back in history to the mid-1970s and the discovery in America that the FBI and the CIA were spying unlawfully on our citizens domestically, and then the Senate had to convene something called the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church. And what did that committee, which sat for over a year, what did they discover? There was systematic spying outside of all judicial rulings, no court authorizations. There were black bag jobs, which means break-ins and illegal search warrants by the FBI. There was wiretapping, unlawful wiretapping of anybody deemed a threat by J. Edgar Hoover, including Martin Luther King, including trying to convince King to kill himself, including the FBI, by most historians now, findings, that coordinating with an intel unit at Chicago PD to actually murder a Black Panthers leader. Right? All of this extrajudicial, there were no rules. So when anybody says, oh, don't worry about it, things will work out. No, we've been there. We've been there. And now we have rules that came out of that Church Committee that actually are the operating guidelines for the FBI, for the CIA. But things had to get very ugly, literally murdering somebody deemed a threat because the FBI director thought the guy was a threat. That's where we're headed here.
Well, and with Trump, there's always a projection, right? I mean, it always struck me as bizarre that he described the court-approved search of Mar-a-Lago to retrieve classified material they'd asked for somewhere between 8 and 15 times, a, quote, assassination attempt. It's clear that Trump already thinks along these lines. What has to be considered a threat that they would have to contend with inside the FBI right now if Trump's reelected, Frank?
Well, among the first things that Trump is going to do, of course, is replace the FBI director, even though, by the way, he's a Republican and a Federalist Society member. But, he's not moving quickly enough or as radical enough for Trump. So he'll go. But beyond that, you're going to see the top echelon of the intelligence agencies, the inspectors general, the DNI, all pledge loyalty to Trump. Their rank and file may lose their civil service protection, so they'll be extremely fearful. And I'm telling you, if you think Trump's threats and intimidations have not impacted decision-making, just look back at the Washington Post reporting about searching or not searching Mar-a-Lago and realize that they were yelling at each other, DOJ and FBI executives, about, this isn't going to happen on my watch. So, talk to Andy McCabe, as I did just a couple of days ago on my YouTube show, who's being threatened by Steve Bannon to charge him on some bogus charges and extradite him if he flees the country. How do you put mechanisms in place right now to stop that from happening? I don't have an answer to that.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.